Brantford-Brant.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Today we are debating Bill C-5 at the report stage. I am profoundly disappointed as a parliamentarian and deeply ashamed as a former Crown attorney that this seriously flawed, reckless and dangerous bill has gotten this far in the process. I left behind a proud and rewarding legal career as a public servant for the province of Ontario, a career defined by holding criminals accountable for their actions, ranging from mischief all the way through to and including first-degree murder, a career further defined by advocating for victims' rights, a concept that is completely alien to this virtual signaling government. Neither this bill or Bill C-21 make any reference to the rights and protection of victims. I was frustrated as a Crown attorney that the judicial system was out of balance. The proverbial pendulum over my career was significantly shifting in favor of the accused at the expense of protecting victims of crime. There must be a balance. This government will repeatedly make statements in this House that they care deeply for victims and that their rights matter, but it is simply talk with no action. An example of this lip service is the fact that the government has not replaced the federal ombudsman for victims of crime, a position left vacant since last October the 1st. Shameful. It's time to dispel the myths and misinformation coming from this government whenever they speak about this bill. Number one, this is not legislation targeted at low-risk offenders. Accused individuals charged with the use of a firearm in the commission of an offense, possession of unauthorized firearm, possession of firearm with ammunition, weapons trafficking, importing and exporting of firearms, discharging a firearm with intent, reckless discharge of firearm, and robbery with a firearm are indeed extremely serious, violent offenses that judges across this country routinely sentence to significant jail sentences, often prison. They are not the type of person as described by our Attorney General when this bill was introduced. We all remember that story. Imagine a young man who has too many pops on a Saturday night and decides to pick up a loaded gun and shoot into a barn. According to our Attorney General, we should feel sorry for this individual, as it would be a cruel and unusual punishment to impose a mandatory minimum penalty. Number two, this is not legislation that reverses former PM Harper's Safe Streets and Communities Act. Several of the charges outlined in C-5 include mandatory minimum penalties that were introduced by Pierre Elliott Trudeau in 1977 and Jean Chrétien in 1995, two Liberal majority governments. Three, according to this government supported by their NDP partners and Green Party members, mandatory minimums are ineffective in reducing crime or keeping our communities safe. The simple fact is that they actually believe this. Instead of virtue signaling to Canadians, they would table legislation to remove all mandatory minimums. 53 will remain in the criminal code if this bill passes. This includes impaired operation of a vehicle. It's important that we hold drunk drivers accountable, yet allow criminals and thugs to terrorize our communities by shooting up our streets. Number four, according to the government, courts from across this country, including appellate courts and the Supreme Court of Canada, are striking down mandatory minimum penalties as being contrary to the Charter. For reasons as previously described, mandatory minimums introduced by previous Liberal governments have been upheld by various courts for over 40 years. 5, this is not legislation targeting people charged with simple possession. Bill C-5 will eliminate 6 mandatory minimums under the CDSA. These include the very serious offenses of trafficking, importing, exporting, and production of controlled substances. Drugs such as fentanyl and carfentanil, the most deadly and lethal form of street drug, where an amount of a size of a grain of salt is capable of killing an elephant, is not serious enough to this government. The same drugs that are causing an opiate crisis that results in daily overdoses and deaths. These killer criminals deserve mercy from this Liberal government. What has this country become? Lastly, this is legislation to address racism and reduce the over-incarceration of Black Canadians and Indigenous offenders. As noted by the Alberta Minister of Justice, Casey Madhu, a Black Canadian, Quote, while Ottawa's new Justice Bill contains some reasonable measures, I am deeply concerned about the decisions to gut tough sentencing provisions for gun crimes. Removing tough mandatory penalties for actual gun crimes undermines the very minority communities that are so often victimized by brazen gun violence. I also find it disingenuous for Ottawa to exploit a genuine issue like systemic racism to push through their soft on crime bills. I have prosecuted in the trenches of close to two decades, unlike the Attorney General and members of this Liberal government. I can state on authority that the overriding sentencing consideration associated with the crimes relating to C-5 are denunciation, deterrence, and separation from society. In other words, it doesn't matter your gender, your ethnicity, or race. Upon convictions, criminals are going to jail, period. It's time for this government to be honest with Canadians and accept that Bill C-5 will not substantially address the over-incarceration issue. Throughout the entire bill, this bill has been debated. I and other colleagues, most notably the member for Kamloops Thompson Caribou, have argued that there is a compromise for this government to consider. A constitutional exemption to all the charges outlined in the bill will give trial judges the legal authority to exempt criminals from a mandatory minimum penalty if they belong to a vulnerable population that is overrepresented in the criminal justice system and who are disadvantaged with regard to sentencing. This exemption would preserve the mandatory minimum penalties, but give judges the flexibility to craft an appropriate sentence. My amendment to this bill at committee was summarily dismissed by the Liberal chair as outside the scope of the study. Shameful. Brantford Police Chief Rob Davis, the only Indigenous leader of a municipal police service in Ontario, testified at committee. He stated, with Bill C-5 and the proposed changes now, we are going to see sentencing become a joke. With turning sentences into conditional sentences, the justice system will be brought into disrepute. People will operate with impunity. Victims' rights are going to be given away for the rights of the criminal. Victims of communities will live in fear of gun violence, fearful of retaliation by armed criminals, and people will continue to overdose. Committee also heard from Chief Darren Montour from the Six Nations Police Service. His testimony was clear. Proposed conditional sentences for violent offenses will not deter offenders from committing further crimes. We are not in a position to continuously monitor sentenced offenders to ensure their compliance with restrictions handed down by the courts. Police services across the country, and especially those with Indigenous communities, are significantly understaffed. We are continuously asked to do more with less, and we cannot sustain this workload. He also stated that he can appreciate the statistics regarding the over-incarceration issue, but along with the rights of offenders, victims and victims' families deserve rights as well. Hundreds of Canadians from coast to coast signed the petition on my website that I recently presented in the House. They called on the government to immediately withdraw Bill C-5. News released to the Liberal government. Canadians are terrified at the prospect that criminals convicted of sex assault, kidnapping, will also enjoy serving that sentence in the comfort of their homes. In fact, the very same homes in which they committed their crimes. Deeply shameful. Madam Speaker, the #1 priority for the federal government is to keep Canadians safe. This government has been derelict in their responsibility. I, together with my Conservative caucus members, will always stand on the side of victims and keeping our community safe by holding criminals accountable for their actions. I will be very strongly voting against this bill, and I encourage all members in the House to do the same. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for
Fleetwood, Port Moody.
Fleetwood, Port Moody.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And I appreciate my colleague's background and the points that he's making in his speech. A couple of quick things. Currently, the minimum mandatory for repeated smuggling of tobacco is 4 years. Yet for most of the firearms offenses mentioned, it's 1 year. So there's an imbalance there in the system. Secondly, we see in British Columbia many times Crown Counsel refuses to approve charges simply because the courts are too full and people have walked. But the third thing is that if I was the Minister of Justice, I'd make dealing in fentanyl the crime of attempted murder. Okay? That said, though, I would ask the honourable member whether or not he trusts judgment, the judgment of judges to hand down appropriate sentences in these serious situations that he mentions.
The honourable member for Brantford-Brant.
I thank you for that question, and I often reflect on every time I hear from government, when I hear from my NDP members, when I hear from the Green members, that we can all calm down as Conservative members because this bill is going to keep communities safe and we can trust our judges to always do the right thing. Judges all come from various backgrounds, and that's why we have a myriad of different judgments from across this country, from coast to coast to coast. There is no consistency in sentencing. So to the answer to that particular question, as a prosecutor for the last 2 decades, previous to that as defense counsel, I have repeatedly seen abuses by defense counsel who are properly retained with illegal funds from trafficking, etc., who do judge shopping. And there are judges who are more lenient than others. Bill C-5.
Questions et commentaires, l'honorable député.
The honourable member from Montcalm. Madam Speaker, I will try to stay calm. I don't know if I properly understood my colleague's speech. When he ironically spoke of people with drug addictions, he said that they were criminals who deserve compassion from the government. Does my colleague know what's being done in the world to fight drug dependence? Does he know how many people were addicted to heroin in Portugal before new programs were put in place to decriminalize? There were 100,000 before, and now there are only 15,000. It's striking, and so I'd like the member to clarify his thought and not take an ironic tone about people with drug addictions.
I appreciate the question, and thank you very much. Perhaps it was lost in translation. That particular statement in my speech was a rhetorical question put to the government because it's that type of language the government is using. The focus of my speech was not on those who are struggling with drug addictions. Our entire focus as a Conservative caucus, even in the last platform for the last election, was all about taking steps to address the rehabilitation. The focus of my speech and the focus of our opposition is the traffickers who are plying these individuals to continue their addictions. That's where our focus ought.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Edmonton Strathcona.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'd like to thank my colleague for his intervention. One thing I will flag for him, though, I found it very interesting that he chose to use a quotation from the past Justice Minister of Alberta, Casey Madhu, considering that Mr. Madhu lost his position as the Justice Minister because he phoned the police chief after getting a ticket he didn't like. It seems like an interesting person to refer to when we talk about justice. But more importantly, would the government, would the representatives from the Conservatives be prepared to support calls from other leaders, from mayors, from health experts, from healthcare providers, from frontline care providers, from police in areas in Alberta to support the decriminalization of small amounts of narcotics? Would that be something he would be supportive of?
Honourable member for Brantford-Brant.
I thank my colleague for that question. And again, it's very frustrating that we continually hear from the NDP and the Green. They want to change the story. They want to turn the page on what Bill C-5 is all about. Bill C-5, for the last time, is not about simple possession. News release to the House. It is not. So I'm not going to respond.
Resuming debate. Reprise du débat. L'honorable